I'm here tonight to talk about two books. One is the Letters of Jonathan Netanyahu, which I compiled with my brother Benjamin, whom some of you have heard, maybe, and Yoni's Last Battle, a book about the raid at Entebbe, which I wrote following extensive research. Both books, as you realize, have to do with my late brother Jonathan, or Yoni, who, as Dr. Entebbe mentioned, led the rescue force at Entebbe on July 4, 1976, and was the only Israeli soldier to die in the raid. A man's life can be looked at in many ways, all the more so the life of a man who is bountiful in thought and deed and diversified in abilities such as Yoni was. When reading his letters, you cannot help noticing an inner richness which was made all the more evident by Yoni's seeming contradictions. An innocent idealism coupled with a clear understanding of reality, an almost youthful enthusiasm when facing new challenges, together with a mature and concrete knowledge of the difficulties these challenges present. An intense love of life, burning or residing in a fearless soul that stoically accepts the inevitability of life's end. A love of people so strong and complete that it seemingly ignores their faults and yet, in fact, is mingled with the unique insight of their shortcomings. I can go on and on. Above all, there was a simple and grand humanity in Yoni, which comes across throughout his writings. These are some of the things that make his book of letters so alluring and thought-provoking. And they are the reason, I'm sure, why so many people in Israel and around the world have read them. The 18th printing, I think it is, of the Hebrew edition has recently been issued, and Yoni's letters have never been out of print in Israel since they were first published more than 23 years ago. And that's a remarkable phenomenon. I don't think there are many or any books of letters, even the most famous people, that have received this much readership. It is not Yoni's fame, his fall at Entebbe, that is responsible for this continuing and remarkable phenomenon. Rather, it's the sense of fulfillment the reader obtains when perusing his letters, his enjoyment upon reading Yoni's descriptions and reflections, and by the end of the book, the feeling of satisfaction one derives from having gotten to know a person like Yoni. Nothing, at least in my eyes, is more fascinating than delving into an interesting man's thoughts. And there are not many things that can compare with the feeling one gets when spending time with an outstanding individual. I will not attempt in my talk tonight to present a full or even partial analysis of Yoni's person. The person as it emerges both in his book of letters and in Yoni's Last Battle. Now and then, when I read a letter from a reader, a letter sent by one of the readers of these books, I am amazed at the perception shown by the reader and wonder at how he noticed some aspect of Yoni's character that perhaps I knew about in the back of my mind, but never fully thought out or expressed to myself. I leave it to those of you who will open the pages of these books to discover for themselves what reflections are aroused in them by Yoni's words and deeds. Rather, what I'd like to do instead is to dwell upon that side of Yoni that has to do with his life's purpose and how it relates to us today. After all, Yoni died in one of the foremost and most successful rescue operations against terrorism in history. He knew full well the risks of the mission, as well as the dangers he confronted in the numerous other missions which he had participated in. But he took these risks willingly. And certainly he did not do so because he was a thrill seeker or an addict to danger or because he had some unquenchable thirst for adventure. In reading his letters, one realizes that this was not the case. For with Yoni, there was a greater purpose to it all. He was 2 years old when Israel was created. He was born on March 13, 1946, less than a year after the most extreme and horrendous attempt out of a long, almost unending line of attempts to exterminate the Jewish people. But these attempts did not end with the Holocaust and with the murder of most of Europe's Jewry. For shortly thereafter they continued in the form of a relentless effort by the Arab countries to destroy the Jewish state that had just been born. There is no question that such a destruction would have brought about the physical annihilation of Israel's Jewish population. And while the destruction of Israel would have left the Jews outside the boundaries of the country alive, it would have meant, for all practical purposes, the end of the Jewish people as a nation. Throughout Yoni's lifetime, Israel was waging a continuous struggle for its very existence. A struggle which has been going on in one form or another to this day. It is this essential fact that we must consider when looking at what motivated Yoni and indeed what motivated many of his comrades. Yoni had an acute sense of history. He lived in constant awareness of the fact that in reality the life of the Jewish people is hanging by a thread. A strong thread perhaps, but a thread nonetheless, made up of the young soldiers of Israel. Between the ages of 18 and 20, during Yoni's early service in the army, he became acquainted firsthand with Israel's military predicament. He got to know what it is that we were up against, as well as the means that were needed to withstand the attacks on us. Once the stark reality of the situation took hold of him, it altered his life. By the end of his compulsory service, and even more so, a few months later, when he took part in the battles of the Six-Day War and was wounded in them, he felt a personal, overwhelming duty to make sure that the thread which was keeping the nation alive was not snapped. Zionism gave us back a part of our ancient homeland and the mechanisms of the state. With these two came something else, something we were lacking for many centuries, an ability to defend ourselves. Transformed from a people totally dependent on the goodwill and protection of strangers and subject with the pendulum-like recurrence to dastardly and inhuman acts by our opponents. We were now able to confront those who sought our demise and overcome them, for now we possess an army of our own. It is this aspect of Zionism and of the meaning of the Jewish state that the mission to Entebbe signified more than anything else. It proved that the Jewish people, once it possessed a homeland, could defend itself in the most extreme of circumstances, even if it meant setting out on a seemingly impossible mission to the heart of Africa, 2,500 miles from Israel. Entebbe was a sign of the remarkable revolution that had occurred in the status of the Jewish people. Any people, if it wants to exist as a nation and not as mere individuals, must be willing to fight for its survival. This is perhaps an unfortunate fact of life, and I know there are many among us who don't like to be reminded of it, but that doesn't alter the situation. This is how the world of men has been constituted since time immemorial, or at least since the creation of nations. I'd like to quote now a passage from one of Yoni's letters. He wrote it to our parents when he was studying at the Hebrew University, debating with himself whether to leave school and return to the army. This is what he wrote. We are obliged to cling to our country with our fingernails, with our bodies, and with all our strength. Only if we do that, if we give all we have for the well-being of the country, will Israel remain the state of the Jews. Only then will they not write in the history books that once indeed the Jews roused themselves to action and held on to their land for 2 decades, but then were overwhelmed and became once more homeless wanderers. And I quote briefly from another letter. Our state exists and will go on existing as long as we can defend ourselves. Well, shortly after he wrote this, he returned to the army to serve as an officer in Israel's elite commando unit. He did so because his heart and mind told him it was the right thing to do. In Yoni, a dichotomy between belief and action was unacceptable. He also felt, with all his being, that he was on the side of a just cause. It was not merely because he was fighting for his own people. It was more than that. He had a firm belief that the cause of Israel was right. And in truth, what could be more just than the struggle for the survival of a people? Yes, we are all aware of the attacks against us from all parts of the globe, every single day of the year, year after year, saying how wrong we are, trying to erode our sense of right and undermine our belief in our cause, and attempting, moreover, to convince us that we are an all-powerful country fighting a weak and homeless people, rather than presenting the situation as it really is, that we are 5 million Jews surrounded by an extremely rich and virulently hostile Arab world, numbering hundreds of millions of people. But just as the multitude of malicious attacks on the Jewish people over the centuries did not delude us into believing them, so these new attacks should not cloud our perception of the truth. No amount of obfuscation, deceit, and of lies hurled against us can change what is real. To give just one recent example, in Durban, in South Africa, several months ago, our nation was defamed and castigated by most of the world's representatives as being racist, and thus, by more than implication, categorized there as being an illegitimate entity to be shunned by all nations and eventually dismantled. But I do not know of a people less racist than ours, which is willing to embrace as its own any person of whatever race or color, if he converts to our religion and shows a true desire to become a part of our nation. Nor do I know of any other country that embarked on a massive airlift in order to bring a sizable African community onto its shores. Yet despite these facts, we are the ones called racists. We are being defamed and vilified, while contrarily, those who seek our destruction are being lionized. Cruel murderers, men who judge justice by the amount of power one has, and whose sense of right and wrong is intertwined with the quantity of blood they can spill, are labeled freedom-fighting guerrillas. Men whose national heroes and official martyrs, these are their official martyrs, are these suicide bombers who try to ensure that as many innocent victims as possible die with them. Such people are to be considered legitimate and even desirable partners for peace with us. Our current adversaries are often looked upon not as what many of them are, killers of innocent men, women and children, that is, terrorists of the worst ilk, but as champions of human rights and freedom. At the same time, young Israeli soldiers forced to fight such a brutal enemy have been labeled as Nazis. What hasn't been said about us by our detractors? Almost anything imaginable. We have even been accused of attempting to poison the Palestinian population, not by defiling their wells, as we were accused of in the Middle Ages, but by literally poisoning the air they breathe and the food they eat. I don't know how many of you remember the accusations hurled against us by the Palestinians nearly 20 years ago, and the big to-do about it in the world media at the time. The media, mind you, did not turn against those who instigated this horrendous lie, but against us. And it doesn't matter that it's our enemies who have been using poison gas on others, or that they may perhaps be the ones sending anthrax bacilli to innocent victims. All this doesn't matter, for it is we who are the poisoners. And when our enemies admit to their heinous crimes of suicide bombings, political assassinations, random sprayings of machine gun fire at passers-by, such as occurred only a short time ago in Jerusalem and a few days before that in Hadera, and such like, at which times they gloat about them, for in their eyes these are highly admirable acts. An admiration, of course, they often suppress when they speak to the Western media. Even then, it is not they who are to blame for them. No. Even on those occasions, it is we who are at fault. For it is our supposed oppression that has caused these acts to be committed. Thus, no matter what, we are the guilty party. That's a very neat arrangement indeed. But in truth, Zionism is as just a national movement as ever there was one. It is a movement which sought to ensure a permanent refuge to a homeless and persecuted people. And it did so not by taking anyone's country, as did most other peoples. That's the history of the world. But rather by having us return to our ancient and beloved homeland, which was a virtual wasteland when we first resettled it, consisting for the most part of rocks, sand, and swamps, sparsely populated and belonging to no existing nation and to no known people. Even territorially, it did not exist as a separate or distinct political entity within the Turkish Empire that ruled it. When my mother was born near what is now Tel Aviv, during the time of the Ottoman rule, a consular letter, of which I have a copy, was sent from the American representative in Jaffa to the one in Jerusalem, Syria, to notify him of the birth of an American citizen. My grandparents, her parents, had immigrated from the US to Palestine in 1911. In those days, the country was considered politically a province of the Turkish Empire, a province defined by various titles, sometimes also as part of Syria. But historically, all the nations of the world conceived of Palestine as the ancient homeland of the Jewish people and in no other sense. Indeed, during the years my mother grew up as a child in the land of Israel, it was she and her friends who were called Palestinians, just as my uncles, when they served in the British Army in World War II, were called by the British the Palestinians. For the Arab inhabitants of the land did not call themselves by that name, and certainly did not regard themselves in any such way, And by the way, most of them had immigrated from the neighboring Arab countries because of the job opportunities created by the Jewish settlement. Now, the British allowed all of them in. The only ones they stopped for coming in were the Jews. But they did not regard themselves in this matter. And if they had a national affinity whatsoever at the time, it was to the larger Arab world. And think of what has happened to this Arab world over the years. The Arabs can say what they will until doomsday, but nothing will alter the fact that it is they, not us, who possess a huge landmass similar to the continental US, consisting of numerous states, each of which considers itself a part of the greater Arab nation, and all having a similar, if not identical, culture, practicing the same religion, speaking the same language, and represented by more than 20 nations into which they divided themselves. Compare this with what we have, one of the smallest and most densely populated countries on earth. Yet despite that, it is we who are being castigated as being expansionist, as being land grabbers at other people's expense. And it is we whose country the world wants to shrink further, so that it may possess a waste comparable to the breadth of an ordinary American city like San Diego. The Arabs know full well why they want Israel to have such a narrow waist. It is for the very same reason that they also continually insist on their so-called right of return, whereby Israel will be flooded with an aggressively hostile and inimical population. They know that a nation with such borders and such a populace would be indefensible from within and without, and collapse. The Palestinian Arabs have a definite and final goal, you see. No matter how many pronouncements of peace, coexistence, the end of terror, they may emit from their mouths when they speak to the West, that is to non-Arabs. Well, Yoni clearly knew where the truth lay, just as he realized what were the intention of our enemies. He was also quite cognizant of their true nature. For who are our enemies? They are the bin Ladens of this world, the Saddam Husseins, the Arafats, as well as Arafat's various other comrades, such as Wadiah Haddad, the Palestinian terrorist who orchestrated the 1976 hijacking of the Air France airliner to Entebbe. And it is not by coincidence that the Palestinian and German terrorists who hijacked the plane landed it in Uganda. For Idi Amin, Uganda's ruthless and murderous dictator, with whom the hijackers had been colluding, was a natural ally for such people, a man of similar hue. I would like to read to you a passage from Yoni's last battle, describing an incident which took place in the cockpit of the C-130 lead plane that carried Yoni and the 28 men of his assault party to Entebbe. But before that, let me just very briefly summarize what some of you might already know. Yoni commanded Israel's elite commando unit called Sayeret Matkal, or also known as the unit whose mission at Entebbe was to fight the terrorists and the Ugandan army and liberate the hostages whom the terrorists threatened to execute. The elite plane also carried some command officers and auxiliary forces from other units who were not to take part in the battle, as well as the flight crew. Behind this aircraft flew 3 other planes, 2 of them carrying the unit's peripheral defense forces, and 1 a medical team and some other support troops. The hold of the first plane was crowded not only with soldiers, but also with Yoni's Mercedes and his 2 Land Rover vehicles. At first, Yoni was sitting in his seat in the Mercedes. He was talking to 1 or 2 of his men and reading a book. But when the Mercedes started bouncing up and down because of air pockets, he left it and went to the cockpit. Now he was very tired. He hadn't slept for several nights, or hardly slept for several nights, and planned to go to sleep there on a bunk bed in the cockpit. But before he did that, he chatted with the pilots and some of the officers he knew. At one point, he talked to Lieutenant Colonel Chaim Oren, whom he knew from their joint service in the Charuv commando unit. That's another commando unit. This is what Yoni said to him during the course of their conversation. I quote now from the book. "If he's there, I'll kill him." "Who are you talking about?" asked Chaim. "Idi Amin," answered Yoni. Chaim was stunned. He urged Yoni to banish the thought from his mind, but his pleading fell on deaf ears. "You can't do something like that. It hasn't even been discussed. You'd have to ask for approval," Chaim said. "I don't intend to ask. If Idi Amin is there, I'm going to kill him," said Yoni, without offering explanations. From Yoni's point of view, the reasons were self-evident. In a letter he had written to Tuti, that's his former wife, 7 years before, he had said, "What an insane world we live in. In the 20th century we've landed on the moon, and there's still more to come. But the 20th century has also seen Hitler and his mass murders, and it saw the horrors of World War I. Yet we still haven't learned. Today we're seeing in Biafra an entire people being wiped out by starvation, and still no one is concerned enough to get this ugly world to do anything about it. All of us, including Israel, including me, are caught up in our own wars, and there's not a single country willing to go in with its army and stop what's happening there. Of course not. No one wants to get involved, but strange animals people are." Now Yoni had firmly decided that if he saw this monster of a man named Idi Amin, who'd murdered hundreds of thousands of his countrymen, and who threw the victims of his torture chambers from the top floor of Kampala's fancy Nile hotel, he wouldn't let him get away alive. End of quote. By the way, as an aside, you might be interested in knowing that the mass murderer Idi Amin is living, and I assume comfortably and well, in Saudi Arabia, a country which gave him shelter following his forced flight from Uganda. After all, Saudi Arabia, one of the highly sought-after partners in the current coalition against international terrorism, owes him a great favor. He aided the forces of international terrorism in the 70s. Such a stand by a man like Idi Amin, who helped Arab terrorists bent on murdering Jews, surely deserves the lasting thanks of a moderate Arab country like Saudi Arabia. But that's an aside, and let us continue now. When Yoni went to Entebbe, he was doing so for his own people and no other. He certainly was not fighting for the whole world, but in a sense, his struggle, and that of Israel, was indeed the struggle for the preservation of values that the world's free societies hold. Yoni's wish to get rid of Idi Amin if he could, for the sake of a people he hardly knew, but with a clear belief that such a man deserves to be disposed of by someone who had the guts to do it, was related to a natural affinity he had for what is considered decent and right by the civilized world. In that sense, he was waging a struggle beyond just that of Israel. It is the same as today's world struggle, namely the one that is going on right now between the West and those who seek to crush it by terrorist means. This current fight against terrorism, if it is to succeed, needs one thing above all: courage. While I'm referring, of course, to the physical courage of facing your enemies in battle and risking your life, as well as withstanding civilian casualties, I'm also talking about a different kind of courage, that of facing up to reality, however harsh it may be, and no matter how much it calls into question notions that have been advocated and praised for a long time now, notions such as the absolute equal worth of all societies and all ways of life. That too requires courage. One half of this courage lies in seeing what you are truly up against, the other half in admitting what needs to be done about it. Let us go back now to the flight to Entebbe. About half an hour or so before the touchdown at Entebbe, while they were flying in the dark over the jungle islands of Lake Victoria, Yoni left the cockpit. He has to be woken up, and they woke him up half an hour before the touchdown. He left the cockpit and went back to the hold. He woke up those of his men who were sleeping and told them to get ready. Once the soldiers were sitting in their places, ready with their ammo vests and weapons, he went among them. He shook their hands, smiled at them, gave them a few words of encouragement, and moved from one to the next. He walked on top of the jeeps, by the way, because there was no room to move on the sides. Now, these were not hardened fighters, you should know. Most of them had not seen combat before. And to one of the young officers, Yoni said, "Don't hesitate to kill those bastards," referring to the terrorists. At first sound, it seems like a strange admonition. He didn't say, "Shoot them quickly before they were able to kill the hostages," or give some other operative instruction, but said, "Don't hesitate to kill those bastards." It was as if he suspected the officer might have second thoughts about shooting them and needed to be reminded that they were indeed bastards, that killing them was the right thing to do. If it sounds strange, you should remember this. Yoni was dealing with Jewish soldiers. And while we think of Israel's youth as a different breed from the diaspora Jews of earlier centuries, in truth, they are in many ways similar. Taking a life is traumatic for a Jew, including that of an enemy soldier. And for some Jews, taking the life of a terrorist, someone who would have absolutely no qualms about mowing down the 105 hostages who were cramped at the hall at Entebbe airport, even that is not necessarily the natural thing to do. Yoni knew this. He knew that a fierceness has to be embedded in them on occasions like this, and that this uncompromising fierceness, or cruelty if you like, in the words of the famous Zionist leader Jabotinsky, is essential not only for the moment of battle, but for our long-term survival. If a nation being threatened by mortal enemies cannot muster up the strength, cannot forge itself so that it has the strength of steel, it cannot do what needs to be done in times of danger, and therefore in the end will not survive. Compassion to your enemies might sound moral, and of course I'm not talking here of compassion towards a vanquished enemy, but an active enemy bent on destroying you. But in the final analysis, it's truly amoral. For if you show such enemies compassion and let them get away with it, they will come back the next day with even stronger determination and will seek to spread greater death and devastation in your ranks. Morality and such an outcome do not go hand in hand. It's not that Yoni killed cheerfully or any more easily than that young officer. Here is what he wrote to his girlfriend Brulia when he was 28. I remember a few years ago, there was a whole month of nothing but border crossings. And on 3 consecutive occasions, I had encounters with Arabs very deep inside their territory. And on one of them, I killed a man, for the first time at such close range, about 2 feet. And I emptied an entire clip of bullets into him till he stopped twitching and died. And each time, when I came home, I wouldn't tell her about it, just hold her tighter each time. It was hard then. To kill at such very close range isn't like aiming a gun from 100 yards away and pulling the trigger. That's something I'd already done when I was young. I've learned since how to kill at close range too, to the point of pressing the muzzle against the flesh and pulling the trigger for a single bullet to be released and kill accurately, the body muffling the sound of the shot. It adds a whole dimension of sadness to a man's being. Not a momentary, transient sadness, but something that sinks in and is forgotten, yet is there and endures. Well, you can see how much Yoni abhorred such deeds, what it caused him to do them. But he knew that justice could not be served if we did not, as a nation, face the reality and the obligations of life as a nation. And be aware of the fact that no one, in the long run, will defend us or die for us. And that if we did not act for our self-preservation, as other living nations did, we will be lost. I think that nowadays, these concepts have to be inculcated not only in the population of Israel, but also in that of other nations of the West. For a long time now, we have been deluding ourselves into thinking that the struggle for survival is finally over, that the end of history, the concept in vogue following the fall of the Soviet Union, has arrived. In Israel, by the way, the end of history went by a different name. It was called by some the New Middle East, a place where just around the corner harmony will exist, nationalism and religion will fade away, and people will forever be trading with each other and getting richer by the hour. Well, unfortunately, perhaps for most of us, neither the end of history nor the New Middle East have arrived. In many respects, things today seem not much different from that of the 60s and 70s, when Yoni wrote his letters and served in Israel's military. The essential problems are similar, and even more so, the solutions to them are similar. It still remains to be seen whether we in Israel, or for that matter the people of America and other countries, are able to muster up the kind of courage that Yoni and many of his comrades had, both the physical kind and the spiritual or moral kind. The answer to this question will determine the preservation of our world. Allow me to finish with a short comment, which seems to me important for understanding Yoni's person. The poet Friedrich Schiller, one of the greatest humanists and lovers of freedom the world has ever known, said, "Life is not the most important thing in life." That's how he said it. More important are great ideals, the kind for which risking your life, or even giving them up, is worthwhile. What is perhaps amazing is that Yoni was imbued with this feeling from the days of his youth. In one of his letters, when he was only 17, he wrote, "I do not fear death, because I attribute little value to a life without a purpose. And if I should have to sacrifice my life to attain the goal I'll set for it, I'll do so willingly." Not long after that, Yoni was already committed to such a goal, guaranteeing the future of the Jewish people whose enemies were threatening it with extinction. Thus, in accordance with what he wrote, he was prepared for the collective existence of his people to sacrifice his personal existence. He put his life at risk many times, and acted so not only because of the demands of battle, but also in order to serve as an example to others. For Yoni knew that if there won't be enough brave souls willing to put their life on the line for the national good, the people of Israel will have no chance of surviving. He behaved in this fashion also at Entebbe, where his actions at the critical moment, as described by those who were there, helped prevent the mission from ending in disaster, and in all likelihood cost him his life. The success of the operation astonished the world. An appropriate expression to this general feeling was given by Drew Middleton, the eminent military analyst of the New York Times, who called it an operation with no precedent in military history. His words deserve to be carefully noted. He was not referring to the military history of Israel or to that of modern times, but to the military history of all countries and all times. In an operation of this kind, when only a hairbreadth differentiates success from failure, the force of leadership is crucial to its success. Yoni's last battle describes how that success was achieved, while the letters of Jonathan Netanyahu reveal the man who could do it. I thank you for your attention.
How do you evaluate Bush's refusal to shake Arafat's hand at the United Nations this week?
I didn't know, I wasn't aware that there was such an incident, and certainly I think that's a proper stand to take. I'm more concerned by what has been said by both by the American administration, especially the State Department, related to the PLO and to the Palestinian Authority and the things that were supposedly told Israel what to do and what not to do about that. That is more concerning.
We're getting a split message. Condoleezza Rice also last week said that Arafat cannot claim to be our co-buddy, co-worker for peace at the same time as backing Hamas and the other terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. There seems to be some split, or
it looks that way. It looks like the State Department is taking the usual pro-Arab line, which it has since the creation of the State of Israel and before. It basically inherited the British Foreign Office line, and there are other forces, of course, in the administration that are pro-Israeli. And I imagine Bush is swaying between the two, perhaps, and perhaps has not yet decided exactly on what line is the best line to take. Yes.
Is it a foregone conclusion that a Palestinian state will exist, and is it accepted in Israel?
Well, our Prime Minister had mentioned that possibility, but that is not a decision of the government of Israel that has ever been made, of any government. And whether it's a foregone conclusion or not, I'm not a prophet, I cannot say, but certainly I think that would be a major mistake from the point of view of Israel. It would be a situation whereby an independent state will have more power than it has right now, where they rule certain territories. It will have the ability to make treaties with other states. It will obviously want an army, it will want an air force, etc., etc. It's very hazardous for Israel. And also they will bring in millions of Arabs inside the state, which is within the heart of Israel. Yes. Well, whoever, I can't see anybody, so the lights are shining in my eyes.
Can you tell us anything about your brother? What's his, our plans, what are his plans?
Well, thank God my brother has the opportunity to appear here on American television quite often. And, certainly more than the Israeli television. And he can speak for himself. Yes.
Any of the hostages read the book? Can you get any feedback from them?
My book? Yeah. My book was written in Hebrew. You're talking about the letters or the book, the Yoni's Last Battle?
Yoni's Last Battle.
It was written 10 years ago. It was published in Israel in Hebrew. It's been reissued since. It's going to be reissued in a few months again. I'm trying to recall whether any certain hostage talked to me about the book, and as far as I recall, no.
During your talk, you mentioned something that I think at least a lot of my friends have found really frustrating about the kind of acts that some of these terrorist groups commit, and then the contradictory sort of media response to them. And I was just wondering what your feelings are in terms of how we should respond or Israel should respond in order to change that message.
Well, there's, of course, a tremendous hypocrisy going on in the world concerning what's going on in the Middle East. And saying that if you bomb and kill Jews, it's okay, because that's a struggle. But if you do so against Americans, that's unacceptable, that's not a struggle. What can be done about it? It's not so easy. You're fighting here a war against really a media that for a large part has a certain agenda. And yeah, Israeli representatives can be much better, can be more articulate, can speak English better, etc., etc. But you're not going to get through to some of the media. I mean, CNN is not going to invite 10 pro-Israeli Israelis. They might invite 10 anti-Israeli Israelis, but versus 10 pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian Palestinians. It's just not going to do that. And here in America, the situation is, of course, much better than it is in Europe, where the press is virtually extremely hostile against Israel and almost, I would say, has anti-Semitic feel to it, what's going on now in Europe. So what can be done is to fight back. I mean, basically to be vocal and to be supportive and to realize also the very dangerous situation we're in. You can hear all this talk about peace. I'm not saying there won't be an agreement. There might be a peace, there won't be. And we certainly don't want another memorial standing out here, similar to the one I just saw. So whatever one can do, one should do to fight this. Yes?
What is the reason for the differences between Ariel Sharon and your brother?
That sort of goes into Israeli politics, local Israeli politics, that I'd rather not go into. And the differences stem, for the most part, from a difference in perception of what should be done. And Sharon has sort of one form of doing things, which is influenced, no doubt about it, by his need or his the wish to maintain a very wide coalition which contains both the left and the right and the middle. And so he took on a certain course, and my brother has a different opinion on what should be Israel's policy. Yes?
There's a question here before.
Sure.
Why doesn't Israel focus on throwing the media out and taking control in a scenario where they can be able to win in that? You know, all we see is the response. You don't see the provocation. And it's a big problem.
Well, the media, you cannot. I mean, you're basically an open country, a democracy. You don't want to sort of isolate yourself in such a way. It probably will do no good, absolutely no good. The media will keep on reporting from the Palestinian territories, and there, of course, when you see only one side, you see the stone throwing, but you don't see the troops in back of the kids who throw stones, which is why the Israeli troops shoot in the first place. A lot of it has to do, by the way, because of physical fear by some of the news media that something will happen to them. As we know, the Italian cameraman who shot that famous Arab who showed his blood-covered hands after the slaughter of the Israelis in Ramallah, he had to go and apologize in the world media for actually photographing that scene, because he was afraid for his life. So just by not allowing the media in, the media will come in. It will come in through one way or another, and you're not going to do much good. Yes, maybe one last question. Yes.
Right over here.
One before last. Oh, you're there.
Thank you.
Okay, yes.
To commemorate your brother, the Jonathan Institute was created to be a think tank for against terrorism. Can you tell us a little bit about what that institute has been doing? Has the American government tried to reach out to it to try to draw on some of its resources to help combat this war against terrorism?
The Jonathan Institute was created many years ago and has not really functioned in many years now. But what it did was try to raise alert the consciousness of the world to the problem of international terrorism. And it did so back in the late 70s and early 80s. The world has finally woken up to this problem. But those were the activities of the Institute for the most part. But that was a long time ago. Okay, one last question and that's it, yes.
Is there any possibility that there are any moderate Palestinians who could possibly arrive at some kind of peaceful place? I mean, clearly, the partners that are being dealt with now, if you could call them partners,
Yes.
are very irrational from our perspective. And it doesn't seem that there could be any chance. But are there not like more Sari Nusseibeh? Yes.
I'm sure there are moderate Palestinians, but they are the ones who remain silent for the most part. And to what extent they have an influence over the Palestinian populace is hard for me to say. It's very hard to gauge at all what is the general mood. But the problem is not only the Palestinian leaders, the current ones such as Arafat. The problem is what apparently is going on is an extreme radicalization of the Palestinian population and the Palestinian youth. Once we gave them control of the areas where they live, we also gave them control of the schools. The schools are the children are being taught extreme radical views. Pure anti-Semitic literature is being taught there. And kindergartens, they're being taught that being a suicide bomber is the greatest thing one can aspire to, whether you're in kindergarten or up to high school, and such like. So there is I would say a worsening of the possibility, or lessening of the possibility of reaching accommodation, because if the population itself is extremely hostile and extremist and aggressive, well, their leaders are going to be certainly at least that, if not more. Thank you very much.